Imagine yourself standing at the mouth of a limestone cave on the coast of South Africa, roughly 75,000 years ago. It is the height of the Pleistocene, and the air carries a biting chill from the rising sea. Inside the cave, the light of a flickering fire dances across the walls, casting long, distorted shadows that seem to breathe. In the corner, a woman sits hunched over a piece of red ochre, meticulously engraving a crosshatch pattern. Her hands are steady, but her knuckles are swollen with the dull ache of arthritis. Her hair is shot through with streaks of gray, and the lines around her eyes are etched deep by decades of squinting into the sun and the smoke of countless fires. She is 48 years old. According to almost every popular history book, documentary, and casual conversation about the ancient world, this woman shouldn't exist. She is a mathematical impossibility, a living ghost in a world where the average life expectancy was supposedly 30. You have been told your entire life that ancient humans lived fast and died young, collapsing from old age before they ever saw a wrinkle. But looking at her, you realize the paradox. If everyone died at 30, who was teaching the children how to hunt? Who remembered the location of the hidden springs during a 10-year drought? Who carried the stories of the ancestors? The truth is that the 30-year lifespan is one of the most successful lies ever told by a statistic. It is a number that is technically true but fundamentally dishonest. Most ancient humans didn't die at 30. In fact, if you could survive the brutal gauntlet of your first 10 years, your flame didn't just flicker. It burned with a resilience that would put a modern office worker to shame. We have been misreading the biological clock of our species for over a century. The problem starts with a single word that ruins our understanding of the past: average. Imagine a room with two people. One is a newborn who tragically dies within hours of birth. The other is a grandmother who lives to be 70. If you calculate the average age of death in that room, the answer is 35. But notice something haunting about that number. Neither person actually died at 35. The average describes a person who never existed. This is the math trap that has colored our view of prehistory. When researchers like Michael Gervin from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and Hillard Kaplan from the University of New Mexico began looking at the data from modern hunter-gatherer groups like the Hadza of Tanzania and the Ache of Paraguay, they found a pattern that looked nothing like a wall at age 30. Instead, they found a valley. Death in the ancient world was not a steady climb. It was a massive, terrifying spike at the very beginning of life, followed by a long, stable plateau, and then a slow rise in old age. The candle of human life has always been hardest to light, but once the flame took hold, it was remarkably difficult to blow out. We have confused the tragedy of infant mortality with a fundamental limit on human biology. If you think your ancestors were elderly at 25, you aren't just wrong about history, you are wrong about what it means to be human. The 30-year-old elder is a myth that falls apart the moment you look at the bones. But if 30 wasn't the expiration date, what was? Why did so many people believe it was, and what were the actual forces trying to extinguish that flame before it could truly shine? The answers are written in the enamel of ancient teeth and the scars on prehistoric femurs. To understand why that flame often went out so early, we have to look at the first and most dangerous barrier: the act of entering the world. For most of human history, the most dangerous day of your life was the day you were born. We have a biological problem that no other primate shares, something anthropologists call the obstetrical dilemma. Because we walk upright, our pelvises are narrow and rigid. Because we are highly intelligent, our babies have massive heads. This creates a physical bottleneck that turned childbirth into a high-stakes gamble for millions of years. In a world without sterile operating rooms or blood transfusions, a baby positioned slightly wrong or a labor that lasted too long wasn't just a complication, it was a death sentence for both mother and child. This is the first reason the average age of death is so low. If 20% of a population dies at 0, the math becomes weighted toward the floor. But the danger didn't end at the umbilical cord. A newborn's candle is incredibly sensitive to the wind. In ancient environments, a sudden drop in temperature, a few days of a mother struggling to produce milk, or a simple respiratory infection could snuff out a life in 48 hours. We see this reflected in the archaeological record. though infant bones are so fragile they often dissolve before we can find them. When we do find them, they tell a story of a species that had to be incredibly fertile just to keep its numbers stable. But here is the paradox. This high risk at the beginning is exactly why humans evolved to live so long at the end. We needed the extra years of life to ensure enough children survive to carry on. The candle had to burn long so that the light could be passed through the dark. Once a child survived the initial spark of birth, they entered a new zone of risk that modern parents can barely imagine. This was the era of the pathogen gauntlet. Between the ages of 1 and 5, the human immune system is a work in progress. It is learning the names of its enemies. In the ancient world, those enemies were everywhere. There were no water treatment plants. Every sip from a stream was a potential encounter with parasites or bacteria. There were no vaccinations for the myriad of zoonotic diseases that jumped from the animals humans hunted or lived near. A simple bout of diarrhea, which a modern parent treats with Pedialyte and a few days of rest, was one of the leading killers of ancient children. It dehydrates a small body so rapidly that the heart fails before the immune system can even mount a defense. We see the evidence of this struggle in the Harris lines on ancient bones, tiny ridges of increased bone density that represent moments where a child's growth literally stopped because the body had to divert all its energy to fighting off an infection or surviving a famine. These lines are like the rings of a tree, recording every time the wind almost blew the candle out. If you survived to age 10, however, something remarkable happened. You became nearly invincible. From the age of 10 to the age of 15, the mortality rate for ancient humans dropped to its lowest point in the entire lifespan. You had survived the gauntlet. Your immune system was primed, your body was agile, and your brain was soaking up the complex skills needed to navigate the landscape. The flame was now burning hot and steady. But that stability creates a question. If these teenagers were so resilient, what finally started to pull them down as they entered adulthood? Why didn't they just live forever? The dangers for an adult in the Pleistocene were rarely the result of old age. Instead, they were the result of the environment finally winning a game of luck. For a young man, that danger often came in the form of high-impact trauma. We are a hunting species, and for most of our history, that meant getting within arm's reach of large, powerful, and very angry animals. When you look at the skeleton of a Neanderthal or an early Homo sapiens, the patterns of broken bones often look remarkably similar to those of modern rodeo riders. They have healed fractures in the skull, the ribs, and the limbs. These were the scars of a life lived in the splash zone of danger. A kick from a woolly rhino or a fall during a hunt wasn't just a medical emergency, it was a test of the community's ability to care for its own. If you broke your leg in the ancient world, you couldn't hunt. If you couldn't hunt, you couldn't eat, unless someone else chose to feed you. This is where we see the first true evidence of the human long life strategy. We find skeletons like Shanidar I, a Neanderthal who lived 45,000 years ago. He was roughly 40 years old when he died, but he had survived a massive blow to the side of his head that likely blinded him in one eye. He had a withered arm that had been amputated at the elbow, and he suffered from debilitating arthritis. He couldn't have survived a week on his own. Yet his bones show that these injuries had healed years before he died. His community kept his candle burning long after he could no longer provide for himself. Because a 40-year-old who has seen everything is more valuable than a 20-year-old who can run fast but doesn't know what to do when the leopards come. The wisdom of the flame was worth the cost of the wax. For women, the adult risks were different but no less lethal. The shadow of childbirth never truly went away during the reproductive years. Every pregnancy was a roll of the dice. But beyond that, women were often the primary gatherers, which meant they were the ones most exposed to the subtle dangers of the plant world. Identifying which tubers were nutritious and which were neurotoxic was a body of knowledge that took a lifetime to master. One mistake, one misidentified root during a hungry winter, and the flame would be extinguished by a silent poison. We also see evidence of systemic stress in ancient women, tooth wear from using their mouths as tools to soften hides, and spinal degeneration from carrying heavy loads of firewood and infants over vast distances. Yet, despite these pressures, the data shows that once women reached the end of their reproductive years, their survival rates often spiked. This leads us to one of the most fascinating theories in human biology, the grandmother hypothesis. Coined by researchers like Kristen Hawkes, this theory suggests that humans evolved to live long past their ability to reproduce because grandmothers provided a massive survival advantage to their grandchildren. A woman who lived to 60 could help gather food and care for the young, allowing her daughters to have more children more quickly. This helper effect was so powerful that evolution actually selected for long life. We didn't just happen to live to 70, we were designed to live to 70 because the elders were the secret weapon of the species. The flickering candle of the oldest members of the tribe provided the light by which the youngest could see the future. This brings us to the great myth-busting moment of the ancient lifespan, the discovery of the modal age of death. If you strip away the infant mortality and the childhood infections, and you just look at the adults who survived to age 15, the most common age for them to die wasn't 30. It wasn't 40. It wasn't even 50. In most studied hunter-gatherer populations, the peak age of adult death is actually between 70 and 72. Let that sink in. Without electricity, without supermarkets, without heart surgeons, and without antibiotics, the human body is biologically calibrated to last about 7 decades. We see this in the Miles method of dental wear analysis, where bioarchaeologists examine how much the enamel has been ground down by a prehistoric diet of grit and unprocessed fiber. When they apply these modern techniques to ancient cemeteries, they find a surprising number of individuals who were old, by any definition. They had lost their teeth, their joints were fused with age, and their bones were thin. But they were there. They were the anchors of their society. The 30-year-old average isn't a reflection of how fast we aged, it's a reflection of how hard it was to get the engine started. Once the engine was running, it was built to go the distance. So why do we still have this image in our heads of the short, brutish life of the caveman? Part of it is a misunderstanding of how we estimate age in skeletons. Once a human reaches 25, their bones stop growing, and aging becomes a guessing game based on decay. For decades, archaeologists were systematically underestimating the age of ancient skeletons because they didn't think people could be old, so they categorized every adult as 20 to 35. We were projecting our own biases onto the bones of our ancestors, effectively erasing the elderly from our history. But then, everything changed. About 10,000 years ago, humans made a choice that should have made our lives easier, but instead, it nearly snuffed out the candle of the entire species. We invented agriculture. This is the great, big reveal of human demography. You would assume that when we stopped running after gazelles and started growing wheat, we would live longer. The food was right there. We had walls and granaries. But when we look at the skeletons from the early Neolithic, the first farmers, we see a horrific decline in health. Life expectancy didn't go up, it plummeted. By huddling together in permanent settlements with domesticated animals, we created the perfect breeding ground for diseases that hunter-gatherers had never dealt with: smallpox, tuberculosis, and the plague. Our diets narrowed from hundreds of different species of plants and animals to just 1 or 2 starchy crops. This led to massive outbreaks of scurvy, anemia, and dental decay. The average height of humans dropped by several inches, and the bones of these early farmers are riddled with evidence of chronic infection and malnutrition. The transition to civilization was a demographic disaster. The flame of the individual was sacrificed for the growth of the population. A farming village could support more people than a hunting band, but those people were sicker, smaller, and died younger. The average age of 30 became more true for a medieval peasant than it ever was for a Paleolithic hunter. We traded the long, healthy life of the nomad for the crowded, diseased life of the settler, and it took us nearly 10,000 years of medical progress just to get back to the biological baseline our ancestors had in the cave. The image of the burning candle is more than just a metaphor for the individual, it is the story of how our species survives. We are not like the other great apes. A wild chimpanzee rarely lives past 35, and even in captivity, they struggle to reach 60. Their candles are simply shorter. Humans are unique because we have a massive gap between when we stop being able to have children and when our bodies finally give out. This gap is where culture lives. It's where the archive of the flame is stored. When you look at an ancient human who lived to be 70, you aren't looking at a lucky survivor, you are looking at a biological library. That 70-year-old was the one who knew which mushrooms were edible during the once-in-a-generation Great Frost. They were the ones who knew how to negotiate a peace treaty with the tribe across the river because they remembered the last war 50 years prior. They were the ones who taught the teenagers that the flickering in the brush wasn't the wind, but a predator's tail. Our longevity is what allowed us to stop relying on instinct and start relying on information. Without the elders, we would still be just another clever ape. The tragedy of the ancient world wasn't that no one lived to be old. It was that when an old person died, a library burned to the ground. Every time a flame went out, a massive amount of hard-won data vanished. This is why we eventually developed art, then ritual, and finally writing, as a way to keep the light of that 70-year-old candle burning even after the wax had finally run out. So, how did most ancient humans die? If you look at the raw numbers, the answer is young. A staggering number of people died before they could even speak their first word. They died of dehydration, of cold, of simple infections that we now cure with a $5 bottle of pills. If you survived that, you were likely killed by a stroke of bad luck, a predator, a fall, a violent encounter, or a contaminated piece of meat. But if you were smart and you were lucky, and you had a community that cared for you, you died of the same things we do today. The slow, inevitable wear and tear of a biological machine that has reached its 7-decade limit. The average human didn't die at 30. They died at 0, or they died at 72. The middle was a place for living, not for dying. We have spent so much time pitying our ancestors for their short lives that we have missed the incredible reality of their resilience. They didn't have our technology, but they had the same biological potential. They walked the same distance, felt the same pains, and looked at the same moon with eyes that were capable of seeing it for 70 years. The 30-year average is a veil that hides the faces of the grandmothers and grandfathers who actually built our world. It turns the past into a playground for the young when it was actually a school run by the old. As we move toward the final transition of our understanding, think back to that woman in the South African cave. She is 48 years old, and in her world, she is a pillar of strength. She has seen children born, and she has buried them. She has outrun lions and survived winters that turned the ground to iron. Her flame is not a weak, flickering thing. It is a hardened, concentrated heat. She is the proof that the human body is not a fragile vessel designed to break at the first sign of trouble. It is a masterpiece of evolutionary engineering, designed to endure, to remember, and to pass on the light. That the short life of the ancient world is a statistical illusion. The reality is that the human story has always been a relay race, where the torch is carried for 70 miles before being handed to the next runner. We are not the first generation to know the beauty of old age. We are just the first generation that has forgotten how hard our ancestors had to fight to reach it. The flame has always been the same temperature, we've just gotten better at shielding it from the wind. Now, pause for a moment and consider your own life. You likely assume that your long life is a gift of modern science, a triumph of the 21st century over the darkness of the past. But modern medicine hasn't actually changed the maximum length of a human life. It hasn't extended our potential. It has simply cleared the road so that more of us can reach the destination that was always there. We have traded the high-stakes gamble of the Pleistocene for a life of managed decline. In the ancient world, death was a sudden gust of wind that could take you at any moment. Today, we have built a glass box around the candle. But the box doesn't make the wax last longer. The biological reality remains unchanged. If you could transport that woman from 75,000 years ago into a modern hospital, she would have the same heart, the same lungs, and the same cellular expiration date as you. The only difference is that her life was a series of narrow escapes, while yours is a series of slow compensations. We live in a world where we can afford to be mediocre survivors. She lived in a world where survival was an elite skill. If you find this perspective on our hidden history as haunting as I do, I invite you to join us for more deep dives into the reality of the human experience. Subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts in the comments. Does knowing that your ancestors lived to 70 change how you see your own aging? We're building a community of people who aren't afraid to look at the cold, hard facts of our past. Because here is the final, undeniable truth. Your body is a 70-year machine that has been under construction for 6 million years. In the ancient world, 50% of your peers would have had their candles snuffed out before they ever reached adulthood. You are the survivor of a gauntlet you don't even remember running. But don't let that comfort you. The average may have changed, but the end of the road hasn't moved an inch. Ancient humans didn't die because they reached 30. They died because the world finally found a way to blow their light out. Your world is quieter, safer, and cleaner, but the wax is still melting at exactly the same rate. You aren't living longer than your ancestors. You are just taking longer to die. The biological clock is ticking with the same rhythm it used in the cave, and eventually, the wind will find you too.